All right. I am been doing Great Lakes maritime history and looking for shipwrecks for many years now. This is my 30th year or so of doing it. I grew up on Lake Superior, up on the Keweenaw Waterway in Houghton Hancock area. And so we had a couple of historic shipwrecks right off of my house growing up, and I became pretty interested in them by that means. And I started investigating shipwrecks at that time by diving these wrecks to clean the fishing lures off of them. And eventually I got curious about what they were, and it started me down the road of doing research. Eventually I was able to identify those wrecks and write them up. And so the rest, as they say, is history. I've been doing this sort of research for quite some time now and looking for shipwrecks on the Great Lakes. I work with most of the different shipwreck hunters on the Great Lakes. Today's topic, the Bannockburn, Lake Superior's Flying Dutchman, came about as the result of a weekly column that I do, or a monthly column that I do in my social media group, the Great Lakes Shipwreck Research Group. We are a social media group that consists of about 4,000 people on social media on Facebook. And then I do a weekly podcast called Great Lakes Shipwrecks Live. And one of the things that I try to do is reinvestigate shipwrecks from scratch, starting with only archival material. What I find so often has happened is people over-rely on the secondhand research of earlier historians, most of which was done in the 1950s, 60s, or 70s, before the information age. And so what I've been finding is that so many of these shipwrecks, the stories that we all accept as sort of gospel truth, are in fact quite inaccurate. And oftentimes a lot more information has come to light, particularly as many of the antiquarian newspapers have been digitized. So one of the wrecks that I looked into and decided to reinvestigate from the ground up using no modern sources. I did not read any Fred Stonehouse books or Julius Wolfe books to reinvestigate this. I went right back to the original sources, and it was the Bannockburn. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I've been having a little bit of trouble with my screen sharing. So what we're going to do is we're going to just follow along with my regular presentation screen. So bear with me, please. Here we go. All right. So I'm assuming everybody can see my desktop. If you can't, Megan, I appreciate if you'd let me know. But it says I'm showing my screen. So the Bannockburn, Lake Superior's Flying Dutchman. Well, what is a Flying Dutchman anyway? And why do we call it that? Part of the reason is that, you know, this legendary ship that you know is a ghost ship, a spectral ship that was lost and is still trying to reach port, is a seminal part of maritime culture. It comes to us down from the Dutch East India Company during its heyday in the 16th century, you know, when the Dutch clipper ships would run from India to Britain. And you know, those long trips with many weeks in the forecastle, the crews would spin these yarns. And one of the ones they made up was about this legendary ship that was a Dutch East India ship that never made it to port, and they would see her every run, and yet she was, you know, never arrived at port, and she became known as a Flying Dutchman. And so that term was passed down sort of through generations and became, you know, sort of a term used widely in maritime circles for a ghost ship, a spectral ship that never makes it back to port, but is seen trying to do so. So the Bannockburn, you know, is really probably the most famous ship of that sort. You know, most of us know the story. She was lost in 1902 on Lake Superior without a trace, seemingly. And then, of course, there were accounts of her being seen for years, right up until just a few years ago. People have reportedly seen the Bannockburn out in storms trying to make her way to port, and has never arrived. But where did that come from, that term Flying Dutchman, and how did it get ascribed to her? Well, as it turns out, it comes from James Oliver Curwood, who is one of the Great Lakes seminal authors. Apologize for the sideways picture here. If you turn your head to the right, I tried to fix it, but my Outlook crashes when I do. Curwood is really the state author of Michigan. He was sort of a guy who wrote books along the lines of Jack London, you know, wilderness adventure books. And many of his books were made into movies. he became very famous and very wealthy. His home is a historic landmark in Michigan. Mount Curwood is named after him in Michigan. And he became a really famous guy. But a lot of people don't know that his first book that he ever wrote was called The Great Lakes and the Vessels That Plow Them. It was part of the American Inland Waterways series, which you see up here on the right. It's also one of the rarest and most collectible Great Lakes books in existence. And it's because it was his first book, and he went on to win a lot of prizes. I think he won a Pulitzer Prize even for his writing. And his first book, wasn't printed in very large numbers. And it goes for about $600 now for a copy. I own the whole set because I collect rare books. What you see behind me is my actual collection of rare Great Lakes antiquarian books. So what Curwood said, and here I'll apologize for another sideways thing, but he says that the Bannockburn is basically our Flying Dutchman, and he goes on to say that she's been seen, trying to make port, a ghostly apparition of ice scudding through the gloom, trying to make it back to port. This was in 1909 that Curwood ascribed this to the Bannockburn. And Curwood's book became famous enough that a lot of people started to call the Bannockburn the Flying Dutchman of Lake Superior. And so the term stuck. But why? Why was he already in 1909, only 7 years after the loss, referring to these sightings? I'm going to talk about that a little bit. I'm going to go into a lot more detail. And one of the things I want to do is sort of debunk this idea that this is some sort of a mystery ship, or that she's somehow, a ghost ship. And the reason I like to debunk that is for a few reasons. The big reason is that when we take an actual historical event like that, and we, start to, use a lot of hyperbole to describe it, and we call it a ghost ship, it overlooks the fact that it's still out there. There's an actual ship on the bottom of Lake Superior to be found. There are 23 Canadian families whose great-grandfathers are unaccounted for, and whose stories are kind of glossed over by the whole woo ghost ship thing, right? But the worst problem is this, that every author that's examined the Bannockburn, with a few exceptions, has chosen to concentrate on the ghost ship angle and really engage in hyperbole without really looking into the actual story seriously. And because of that, she hasn't been reinvestigated in many years, because she's a ghost ship, and that's the fun story to tell. But the truth of the matter is that there's a lot more known nowadays, and I think this ship is far from a ghost ship. I think she is findable, and I will talk about that. So let me tell you a little bit about her background. She is an unusual vessel for the Great Lakes because she was built in England. She was built in 1893 on the River Tees by the firm of Sir Railton Dixon and Company for the Montreal Transportation Company, which is a Canadian company. Their primary business was hauling coal and raw goods up to Fort William, which is now Thunder Bay, Ontario, on northern Lake Superior, and bringing grain back. And she would bring the grain back primarily to Kingston, but also to other ports like Port Colborne on the way back. She was steel-hulled and a good-sized vessel with 2 decks, 244 feet long. She was, by all accounts, a really staunchly built vessel. She was built by ocean standards, as the British did. And so it was unthinkable that she should, sink on the Great Lakes. But she was a single propeller vessel, not a double propeller. She had a single triple expansion 3-cylinder steam engine, which was adequately powered, in fact, a little overpowered for her day. And you can see some pictures of her here. This one on the lower right is one of my favorites, this postcard of her towing the steam barges Minnedosa, the Minnedosa entering Port Colborne on Lake Erie, with heavily laden with a cargo of grain. She had a sister ship named the Rosemount, and the Rosemount was built 3 years later, also in England. And she was almost exactly identical. And what's interesting about the Rosemount is she was on the lakes at the same time as the Bannockburn, and looked just like her. And she had no problems. She sailed until 1930. They sent her out for the ocean trades for about 10 of those years. She had no notable issues. The Rosemount lasted almost until World War II. She was scrapped at Sorel, Quebec in 1937. So, was there a fatal flaw with the Bannockburn? Probably not. By all accounts, she was a really staunch ship, and her identical sister lasted until 1937. So, the Rosemount and the Bannockburn were involved in full trans-lake commerce. They were what were known as canalers. And so, because they could pass through the Welland Canal here between Lake Erie and Lake Ontario, and they were built to that length, just under 250 feet, so they could pass through the lock there. And the main reason for these ships, on the lakes was really as grain carriers, because Port Arthur had come online. The Canadian prairies had started to produce amazing amounts of grain. Sometimes the Bannockburn, would actually sail to American ports. Occasionally she'd come to Duluth. So there are accounts of her in the vessel passages going to Duluth, but most commonly she went up to Lake Superior, and then she would drop off grain either at Midland, Port Colborne, or Kingston. Her home port was Montreal, and she'd occasionally go all the way up to Montreal. But generally speaking, she stayed on the Western Lakes. She, to my knowledge, never entered Lake Michigan. And she was part of a large fleet of vessels that did these routes. She wasn't the only one. There was probably 50 vessels that were running these routes in the Canadian grain trade up to Port Arthur, Fort William. So that was kind of her raison d'etre. That's why she was built. So she had a pretty short career, 1893 to 1902. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about her final run. I'm going to talk about what more we've been able to find, because we know quite a bit more about her. So on her final run, she locked up into Lake Superior through the Soo Locks at 8 in the morning on Wednesday, November 19th. This is an important point. She was one of 14 other vessels locking up that day. A lot of people don't realize how many vessels were on Lake Superior in 1902. There were a lot, and that'll become important. She was under the command of a 37-year-old mariner named George Wood. He had a crew of 20 young sailors. Almost all of them were under 22 years of age. Some people speculated there could have been some inexperience there, but I doubt it. Wood was a well-known and experienced mariner, and they had never had any problems. The Bannockburn could go about 10 to 15 miles an hour, depending on the load and weather. She reached Port Arthur, which was about 250 miles from the Soo, during the early morning of Thursday, November 20th. And so, November, tough time of year to be out on the lakes, right? But it was pretty decent weather by all accounts. Once she got to Port Arthur, she took on 85,000 bushels of Manitoba wheat, and she departed before midnight. She wanted to get underway because a storm was coming. They, by 1902, they had some indication. There was wireless already, so they knew that weather was going to get bad, but they didn't know how bad. There wasn't modern weather forecasting. Here's an important point that you don't see often. When she was leaving Port Arthur, she grounded on a mud or a sandbank, and she was hung up there for quite a few hours. She was freed in the early morning of Friday, November 21st, and resumed her trip. That may have played a role, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But she was bound for Midland, Ontario, and she was going down Lake Superior to the Soo Locks. There are shipping lanes on the Great Lakes, and they were at the time. They're shown on the nautical charts of the day, which I'll bring up later. Captains of steam vessels made money by staying on those lines, right? They were the shortest distance between 2 points. They gave a course and a distance. And if you steered that course, you would, number one, get there quicker. Number two, save fuel, right? And if you didn't, if you couldn't steer straight, or if you weren't a good navigator, you'd eventually be relieved as captain. So ships really, try to stay on those shipping lanes. And I can tell you from my own experience and from that of many other wreck hunters that we look along the shipping lanes because that's where the ships are supposed to be. All right. So she probably, in fact, we know she was on the shipping lane. That become important. Let's talk about the storm. The storm that was coming was a typical, November storm, not particularly violent by most accounts. It came out of the northeast, which most of them do. The Weather Bureau records exist for this storm, and I was able to find them and look at the weather reports and the synoptic weather maps for this. This was a small, localized, intense disturbance over Lake Superior. Maximum gusts got up to 50 miles an hour on the lake, and there were some 47-mile-an-hour gusts reported at Sault Ste. Marie on the 22nd. So this is big winds. You know, if you've been out in a 40-mile-an-hour gale or a 50-mile-an-hour gale, you know that that's probably 15-foot waves, right? And that's probably what they were in. So 15-footers on Lake Superior is big waves, but not dangerous to a big boat. I've gone out to Isle Royal and the Isle Royal Queen in 12-footers before. Not by choice. They came up without the captain realizing it. But suffice it to say, today a modern 1,000-footer, you know, wouldn't be scared of that. A 200-foot vessel wouldn't choose to go out in 15-foot waves, but wouldn't be worried about being in them. So what's interesting is that the clearance records at the Soo suggest that there were at least 40 other vessels in transit during that storm on Lake Superior, and a few of the captains reported that the storm was serious. A small number said it had been the worst storm in a decade, but the vast majority didn't. The reason is the storm was small and localized, right to that area of northern central Lake Superior. And so, although there were many, many vessels on the lake, very few reported anything out of the normal. By the 23rd, the winds had swung around out of the northeast and rapidly diminished. So the Bannockburn had left, you know, on the 22nd, just before the height of the storm. Next day, the winds had swung around and it really decreased. And the storm had moved itself, you know, sort of in a southeasterly direction towards Sault Ste. Marie. It was done and gone and over the lake probably within about 12 hours. What's interesting is that, you know, a lot of time passed before the concern for the Bannockburn was really felt. On the 26th, nearly a week after her departure, newspapers started to express concerns. Although she had survived worse conditions, most ships had, by all accounts, the storm wasn't terrible. Some people felt that maybe she was sheltering behind Caribou Island or somewhere up on the northeast coast of Lake Superior in some bay, you know, riding out at anchor or perhaps disabled. And so tugs were sent up there to look for her. But invariably, you know, hope started to dwindle. And finally, November 28th, the Algonquin, another vessel that was running on the same course as her, arrived home in Canada where she had been, and she reported sighting the Bannockburn. Now, some people reported that she was ashore on Michipicoten Island, but that proved to be a hoax. Captain McMaw of the Algonquin was the last to see her, and he passed her on Friday morning, so not long after she had left. And he says she was 7 miles to the southward of him and 40 miles from Isle Royal. So if you follow the shipping lane where it's 40 miles off Isle Royal, that's where she was. And I'll show you that on a map. Both boats were on the same course, but the sea was running very high, and Captain McMahon's own vessel was taking on water. He watched the Bannockburn narrowly, he said, several times to see how she was progressing. A few minutes after he last saw her, he looked again, but she passed from sight. And he didn't think of anything about it again, but you know, she was lost from sight so quickly that he felt that something very sudden must have happened. And this is sort of, you know, one of the things that came out is a lot of people thought her boiler must have exploded. Well, that seems really unlikely. Her sister ship's boilers never exploded. It was very uncommon for a ship's boilers to just explode on the lake, but nobody else could come up with any other reason. So that's sort of what they stuck with. You know, the next thing that came out about the Bannockburn was another sighting by the passenger steamer Huronic, which was also bound up the lake at that time. And the reason the Huronic sighting has become sort of famous is that a very famous future author and historian, Fred Landon, was a young man working as a waiter on the Huronic at the time. And he noted in his diary that they had been buffeted by a substantial storm. And then he later recounted that he believed they had passed the Bannockburn on the night of the 21st. Based on her lighting configuration, because it was at 9 o'clock at night that they would have seen her. So I went back to the Soo Locks records, the vessel transit records at the Soo Locks. And what I found is that the Huronic locked up at 11:20 a.m. on the 21st. Given the bad weather, she might have been in the area that the Bannockburn was in by 8 or 9 o'clock at night. That's possible, 9 hours to get up there. However, a passage of about 8 to 12 hours happened between the time the Algonquin confirmed seeing her, and the Algonquin knew her. The captain of the Algonquin was always on the same route as her. He knew her. He saw her in broad daylight. But why is it that 12 hours, 8 to 12 hours later, the Huronic would see her, not far away? It seems unlikely. Also, the Huronic only saw her at night, and tried to judge her by lighting configuration. Her sister, the Rosemount, was actually also on the lake at the time. So it seems possible that it could have been a mistake, a case of mistaken identity. The other point is that over 40 different freighters were on Lake Superior that night. So, how the Fred Landon could have made her out just by her lights with 40 other vessels on the lake, I think the Huronic sighting is at the very least suspect. So these other vessels that were on the lake bring up some interesting points. One of the other vessels that was always on the same run was the steamer Chile. And the Chile didn't report her either. I'm gonna go ahead and bring up a document here for you that hopefully you can see it. Let's see. No, it's not gonna work. No, I'm not going to do it. I'm going to go back to the thing. So what I have is the Soo vessel traffic log from that that whole week, and I show the previous few trips to the Bannockburn. She had been, traversing the lake at least 3 different times in the previous 2 months. She had come into Lake Superior, and what I show is I show all the vessels that locked up with her that day, and all the vessels that have been locking down. And so I was able to come up with, a hard list of 40 vessels that were on the lake. Out of those, a good 10 of them were on that run up to Port Arthur. Why didn't they see her? Why didn't any of the other vessels see her? There were many other vessels. The only vessel that saw her was the Algonquin. So obviously something happened very quickly to the Bannockburn, and we kind of know where she was. We know where she was last seen. Well, the next we hear about the Bannockburn is a sighting from the Rockefeller, also known as the Meteor, later named the Meteor, which is kind of what this event is about, right? The Meteor is one of Superior's museum ships. The Rockefeller passed through a debris field roughly south of where the vessel is last seen. The Rockefeller reported passing through wreckage off Standard Rock. There was no other vessel missing on Lake Superior. And so, the vessels that had been searching for her over off Caribou Island and in the eastern end of the lake didn't find anything. And it became pretty clear that she had foundered somewhere, shortly after she was seen by the Algonquin. And I'll show you why on the map in a little bit. There were a few other accounts that I'll talk about. Now the Rockefeller, one important thing about the Rockefeller sighting was that she had been downbound with iron ore, and she was on a different shipping lane. She was on the shipping lane around Keweenaw Point, so significantly further south. And the wreckage had drifted south east as expected, because it was being blown in that direction by the wind, which had been out of the northwest. She didn't stop to examine the wreckage, but there was no other ship missing, so not too many other vessels it could have been. All right, so a couple other things happened that are a little somewhat telling. A bloody life jacket was found at Grand Marais by one of the keepers there. Captain Ben Trudell of the Grand Marais Life Saving Station found a canvas life jacket floating off the beach, and it was stenciled Bannockburn. And this is part of some of the hyperbole that comes in. There were some stains on the straps, and ooh, it was blood. It could have well been, especially if there was a lot of churn and debris. But They searched and found additional minor wreckage. What you find is that Grand Marais is right on a line with where the Bannockburn would have gone down. So this is an important graphic here that I'm going to show you. And this is kind of the key to where it is. This is an actual nautical chart from the day. It's from my personal collection. I own the original of this map. It's from 1898. And what you see is the path that the Bannockburn was on. You see the wind direction here coming out of the northwest. And you see the shipping lane. And I've drawn a box around the shipping lane. There's an X here where the last sighting was made in the early hours of 1121, right there. So about 40 miles from Isle Royal and due north of Keweenaw Point is where she was last seen, on the shipping lane by the Algonquin. Now, what you'll see is that the Huron sighting would have had to have been quite a ways further south. And I don't think she made it that far. Here's why. The Rockefeller reported her debris off Standard Rock and with a pretty accurate location just to the northeast on 1128. And here's the X. So if the debris, if she was last sighted up here and the debris is down here, how could she have made it as far as the Huronic sighting? Her debris would not have washed back towards the Keweenaw Point, right? And then if you look further down, draw a line down to Grand Marais, right? That's all in a line. You can line up the last sighting with the Rockefeller debris with the Grand Marais account, right? With the wind direction, by the way. It's all in a line. That wasn't lost on me when I graphed this out. The fact that she disappeared so quickly and that, she was on the shipping lane, obviously. And I don't think she made it as far as the Huronic reported sighting. I think that was a different vessel that was seen. There were certainly enough vessels on the lake. Suggests to me that she was lost shortly after her last sighting. Her debris was blown, down here. It was seen by the meteor, and then blown further down where it came ashore. What was left of it came ashore at Grand Marais. So this is an important analysis, I think, and something that suggests that she might be in a much smaller area than we perhaps previously thought, and that this vessel might be findable. Let's talk a little bit more about a few things. There were a few other accounts that kind of feed into this Flying Dutchman thing. Several months later, the next spring, in fact, in June of 1903, another life preserver and ore were recovered from Caribou Island. It's not known if these were authentic. I've never been able to find a news account that said that it was stenciled Bannockburn, but one of the things you find is that the ore, had the name Bannockburn carved into the ore and etched in blood, which is a folk tale, obviously, about it. But so this Caribou Island debris sighting, I think, is perhaps suspect. But things continue to roll in, and this is where the Flying Dutchman legend comes in, and why Curwood seized on it is that the papers kept reporting these debris sightings. The steamer Crescent City on June 7th, 1905, nearly 3 years after the Bannockburn's disappearance, reported that they found a ship's deck and pilot house floating 15 miles west of Whitefish Point. And that was also attributed to the Bannockburn, despite the passage of 3 years. Obviously, it wasn't. I mean, we kind of know that, right? And there is enough debris floating around the lake, and enough shipwrecks too, by the way, in the ensuing years, that it could have been from another vessel. But the Bannockburn became sort of the shipwreck du jour that was on everyone's mind. And so anytime something was found, it was the Bannockburn. And this is how these sightings started. So pretty much any time you saw a ship on the lake that you couldn't identify, or there was a debris sighting, it became the Bannockburn. So here we are 2 years later after this article about the Crescent City report, and Curwood calls her the Flying Dutchman of Lake Superior because she's seen like this, trying to make port. And so that's all it took for this to become a ghost ship and a legendary ship, is these subsequent sightings of wreckage and subsequent sightings of the vessel. So, all right. I want to put to bed another bit of hokum that I frequently hear about the Bannockburn, and that's that, oh, she must have hit Superior Shoal. Most of you know the story. Just before World War II, a Canadian survey vessel was traversing the lakes doing depth transits, just mapping the lakes in greater detail. All of a sudden, their sonar gave them a wild reading, and oh my God, it got to be 20 feet deep in the middle of Lake Superior. They actually turned around and went back to verify, and sure enough, there's an underwater mountain right in the middle of Lake Superior, right up here where you see the word Superior Shoal. So immediately, when this made national news, scientists find previously known underwater mountain, and of course, the first thing that happened is everybody said, well, that's obviously where the fill in the blank disappeared. Everything from the Manistee to the, pick your wreck, pick your ship that went missing on Lake Superior, But the one that most people cited was the Bannockburn. And of course, the Sarasols and Inkerman, the French minesweepers, must have hit Superior Shoal. Here's the problem with that. Bannockburn was on the shipping lane. Her debris, she was last sighted up here. Her debris was found here. What she would have been doing over at Superior Shoal, the wind was in the wrong direction. She wouldn't have been over that far. And then the wind, direction wouldn't have taken her debris where it did. So the other, of course, thing that kind of puts it to bed is that Superior Shoal has been surveyed in great detail. It wasn't long after Superior Shoal was found that wreck hunters got out there. And a number of other wreck hunters have been out there with side scan sonar. And then in more recent years, there have been serious, multi-beam sonar surveys of Superior Shoal and of the depths around it. And there are no shipwrecks there, absolutely none. So, the myth that the Bannockburn hit Superior Shoal is exactly that, a myth. She is probably somewhere out here in the near the area where she was last seen, if the wind and debris studies can be given any credence, and the fact that she was not seen by many other vessels coming down the lake, especially as she got further down here. All right. So what happened to her? This is one of the more interesting things that I found, and one of the reasons that I think it's really important to reinvestigate these wrecks from scratch. So often when people want to look into a shipwreck, what do? They get Fred Stonehouse's book and Julius Wolfe's book, and they read them and they say, well, I know everything I need to know that can be known now. And that's just not the case. Fred's a close friend, and I knew Dr. Wolfe as well. And excellent researchers. But guess what? They wrote those things before the internet, and they didn't have access to the information we do now. It's very important to revisit these wrecks. And here's what I found. This is from a paper in Montreal 2 weeks after the Bannockburn's loss. And it says, in connection with the loss of the steamer Bannockburn, the statement of a Kingston blacksmith, John Maloney, may be accepted as important. And he says, I was the Montreal Transportation Company's blacksmith and braced the rudder quadrant as the hub was split. I have no doubt that it broke, and the combined efforts of the crew were insufficient to handle the rudder in a storm when the quadrant gave way and the vessel, being at the mercy of the sea, foundered. So this was something that was not previously known, right? That the hub on her steering quadrant for the rudder was split, and that he repaired it. And he braced it. He didn't do, replace it. He just braced it. Now, she also stranded on her way out of Thunder Bay. And so, did that rudder, was it lodged there in the clay? It could well have been, even if it wasn't. They were in a following sea as they were coming down the lakes in 15-foot waves, with those waves coming in and crashing in on the stern of the boat. Any of you who have ever steered a boat in a following sea where there's a heavy sea, you know that it's very, very hard on the rudder, because the rudder is constantly getting pushed from astern. And if you turn that rudder and the wave comes in and hits it while it's turned, it really smashes into it. So what are the likelihoods, if they had a damaged rudder quadrant, that it snapped and set them in the trough of the seas? Probably pretty likely. I think that The blacksmith, John Maloney, for the Montreal Transportation Company at Kingston, would have no reason to impugn his own work, right? He's not doing this because he wants to be famous. If anything, this would make it sound like he didn't brace it very well. I think he obviously admitted to it because he felt that it was an important point. And I tend to believe it. I think that this is what happened to the Bannockburn. I think she was, heading down the lake in a following sea in 15-foot waves, and I think her rudder broke. She went into the trough of the seas fairly quickly. She was carrying grain cargo. Grain cargoes are notorious for shifting. I think once it shifted, she succumbed fairly quickly and went to the bottom. They didn't have time to launch lifeboats. Whatever happened fast. And that would make sense. I think she probably capsized. And so, this answers a lot of questions about why other ships didn't see her and what likely went wrong with the Bannockburn. So why don't we search for her so we kind of know where she is, right? Some of the challenges are that she's very far from shore. This is about a 30 to 40 mile boat ride from Copper Harbor, Michigan. It takes a lot of money. The big boats that you need to do that search don't get miles to the gallon, they get gallons to the mile. And so, 40 miles, you're starting to get into hundreds of dollars of gas money. Also, the water's really deep, right? So, you need some pretty good sonar equipment. You're not finding this wreck so sport divers can visit her. She's going to be in 800, 900, 1,000 feet of water. You need a pretty good remote operated vehicle to drop down there, or a good drop camera. The other thing you need is a weather window. You can't side scan in waves that are over about 2.5 feet, maybe 3 feet if you've got a good, bungee system on it, because the side scan will bounce up and down and you'll lose contact with the bottom. And so try to find, a day or a couple of days in a row, maybe 3-4 days, where you can just sail out into the middle of Lake Superior in calm weather and search for 2 days. That doesn't happen very often. It's also a large grid. So even though we kind of know where she is within maybe a 5 by 5 mile grid, that's being generous, 8 by 8 mile grid, that's 64 square miles. That's pretty big. So the other problem is that if you're a wreck hunter, there's opportunity cost. There's other easier wrecks to go after, hundreds of them on the Great Lakes. So even though the Bannockburn may have some, cachet and some notoriety, there's other easier wrecks to search for. That said, I'm confident the Bannockburn will be found, and probably not in the distant future. And the reason is the technology is really changing, and the lakes are being mapped. They're giving up their secrets. I think autonomous underwater vehicles are probably going to find a lot of shipwrecks. These are side scan sonars that swim around, without a boat towing them. They're essentially torpedoes with motors on them and computers on board, and they go underwater, down pretty deep. And you put out four buoys out, marking out a square area, right, for repeater buoys, and it'll just go back and forth within the grid of those 4 buoys. And when it's done mapping the bottom, it surfaces, and you come out and pick it up, and it'll download the data, and it'll show you all the greatest hits that it ran over. So autonomous underwater vehicles are kind of a big thing that's coming. Deep lake mapping projects have been done a lot, and they're getting much more accurate with multi-beam sonar. And so a lot of areas of the lakes have been mapped in high resolution now, and a lot of shipwrecks have been found that way. But probably the thing that's found the most shipwrecks on the Great Lakes that are in that, sort of Flying Dutchman class are aeromagnetic surveys. So what they've done on the Great Lakes is mapped anomalies, magnetic anomalies, with airplanes, and they'll fly over and do these transects. And what they're doing is gathering scientific data for the most part about magnetic anomalies. It'll tell them they're useful for oil exploration, for locating where meteorites or meteors hit the Earth, various other things. There's a lot of interest in it. And so there have been a number of these done on Lake Superior. And one of the interesting things is that the data has been collected by various wreck hunters on the Great Lakes. And you can see oarboats, on the surface from that data, because they're large metal bodies. and they have a magnetic signature. And in the parlance, we call them floaters, meaning they're on the surface. But there are also magnetic signatures on the bottom of the lake that are the same size as a ship, and those are shipwrecks. And that is how the Henry B. Smith was found, Marquette's legendary ship that went missing in the storm of 1913. It was found with aeromagnetic survey data. That is what I found when I reinvestigated the Bannockburn. I think it's well worth reinvestigating these wrecks from scratch for that reason, and not just relying on the work of, say, Fred Stonehouse or Dr. Wolf, competent as that work was for its time. And so I frequently research a wreck. I do a lost ship of the month where I reinvestigate a wreck from scratch, and I post the findings on the Great Lakes Shipwreck Research Group. So if you're interested in Great Lakes shipwrecks, particularly those on Lake Superior, and you would like to know more, you can feel free to join the Great Lakes Shipwreck Research Group on Facebook. Just go on Facebook and look up Great Lakes Shipwreck Research Group. Also, our weekly podcast, Great Lakes Shipwrecks Live, is posted on YouTube. You just look for the Great Lakes Shipwreck Research YouTube channel, and you will find them there. I've redone many of these kind of legendary Great Lakes wrecks. So that is about all I have. I hope you enjoyed the talk. I have also posted this as an article called Revisiting the Bannockburn, Lake Superior's Flying Dutchman. It is posted on Jim Kennard's website, shipwreckworld.com. And I go into considerably more detail in the article on shipwreckworld.com. So if you want to go there and read this presentation in written form in the paper I wrote it up in, you can go to shipwreckworld.com. So at this time, I will entertain any questions if anybody has any.
Hey, Brandon, this is Tim Moore, and I don't know if you can hear me.
I sure can.
All right. Hey, that was a good presentation. I like how you go back to the source information and try to draw out a better synopsis. That's really good. Stuff I've done around here, I'm in the Sarnia St. Clair River area, and I've always had to go back to original source material. It's interesting the different stories you read after the fact and how many things are wrong or misleading, or you can just totally throw it out. Anyway, I really enjoyed that. I just want to let you know, while you were talking, I was looking at the area on my navigational chart. That's a pretty deep part of the lake in that area.
It sure is. And I do think we could find the wreck out there. We just found the Paramarket 18, Ken Merriman, Jerry Eliason, and I went and dropped a camera on her in 500 feet of water in Lake Michigan. And of course, they found the SR Kirby in the Hudson out off Keweenaw Point in 800 feet of water. So we're able to put camera on them. So it's possible to do. I do think that the Bannockburn is eminently findable, but you have to really want to find her, you know. And to your point about reinvestigating, you know, I didn't find a lot of hokum with this other than the obvious hyperbole from Curwood. But what I did find was new information that people didn't have. For example, previous authors didn't think to look at the Sioux Locks vessel passage data. I was able to get the exact time that the Bannockburn transited through the locks, the exact time the Uronic did, you know what I mean, and calculate all the other vessels that were on the lake on that route at the time, because that data is all preserved. And likewise, many news articles that, you know, were in, say, the Canadian papers, like the one of the blacksmith there for the Montreal Transportation Company, were overlooked. They weren't accessible to researchers 30, 40 years ago. And so it does kind of present you with the smoking gun, I think, in the case of the Bannockburn, what really happened to her. And lastly, just to revisit the other point that I think is so important is that, you know, again, when we mythologize these wrecks, we do a disservice to the people who lost their lives on them, because the Bannockburn isn't some legend, right? It's a real ship. with real people that died. And I think we owe it to them to tell the story, to tell it accurately, and to eventually find the grave site of these people who died.
Right. Provides closure for the families.
Well, yes, when especially I mean, they're great grandchildren by now, but it is.
The legends in the family.
That's right. And I think, we do a disservice, like I say, when we, present these as pure hyperbole. People you tend to lose sight of the fact that it was a real ship and it's out there. I think if you talk to the guys, like when we dropped the camera on the Paramark Hit 18, I had been looking for that ship with different expeditions for years. And of course, it's far from shore. We never found it. But it was always sort of an abstract idea, right? It was always like a myth or a legend. But when the camera went down and we saw that thing destroyed and mangled beyond recognition and plunged into the bottom of the lake on a sharp angle like that, it brought it home that this is a real grave site and a real shipwreck. And it was a scene of an unimaginable tragedy and disaster at one time. And, it makes it all the more real. And so I hope we can do that with the Bannockburn and kind of bring it out of the realm of legend and bring it into the realm of an actual historical event.
Yeah, that'd be great. Good job.
Thank you. Other questions?
Or when they went to Port Arthur, if there were any additional records doing repairs to the hut of the rudder.
So I'm not hearing that at all. I'm wondering if Megan can repeat the question for me.
If we come up to the computer, are you able to hear me right now?
Yes, I can hear you. Could you repeat the question for me?
You want to come up and yeah. It's a lot to repeat, so I'll have her come up.
Okay, thank you.
Can you hear me now, Brendon?
Hi.
Hi, I'm Sophie Stewart. I work with Tammy and Caitlin at the Historical Society.
Oh, sure.
Yeah. So I was asking if you've looked into any additional information corroborating the blacksmith's report that he had braced the rudder. Did you find any records either on the Kingston side or on the Port Arthur side of records of that happening officially, or is it just from what you found his little blurb in that newspaper article to prove that?
I found a number of accounts that he gave. They're all the same. I think they're probably, he talked to a few reporters and gave that account. There will be no official records of those kinds of repairs, certainly not from that era. I have no reason to doubt him. He was impugning his own work. There are a number of different criteria we use for determining if a historical account is true. And these likelihood criteria play into it. And one of the things that makes something more likely is if it would tend to embarrass you to admit it. And this would fall into that category where why would this man impugn his own work? He clearly felt that it was important to confess up to this, and I have no reason to doubt it. It was also reprinted pretty widely on the Canadian side. It didn't make it into the American papers. But like I say, I found it in maybe 4 or 5 different news sources, Canadian news sources, where it was either reprinted or he had talked to maybe 2 or 3 reporters, and that was as far as it went.
Yeah, I just found that as a really interesting detail, so I was wondering if it had spiraled into anything else. But thank you.
No, yeah, I tried. Believe me, I went after it pretty aggressively, and I wrote this up on a pretty public forum, and I published it in social media as well as online, and nobody's really come forth to give me any more information about it. But I do suspect strongly that that's what happened to her, because when you look at the fact that her sister ship didn't have any troubles and lasted almost until World War II, she was built for the ocean. She was having no trouble. The waves weren't that big, 50-mile-an-hour winds. And this is modern scientific era weather data. We know how fast the winds were. We know kind of the intensity of the storm. She shouldn't have gone down. She shouldn't have run into trouble. What would sink that ship? Did her boiler explode like the people of the day were saying? I highly doubt it. Ships' boilers don't just explode, you know. But if the rudder quadrant had been broken and just braced, and then she's in a following sea with these big waves after stranding while coming out of Port Arthur, sounds like a plausible explanation to me.
Definitely. Thank you so much.
Sure. Any other questions about the Bannockburn? All right. Well, thank you everybody for your time. I hope you enjoyed the talk. And I got even the meteor is worked in there because she's the one who found the Bannockburn's wreckage. So local connection there. And again, if you want, I think we're recording this. So
we are.
this will be available for you to watch later if you want to share it with others. As I mentioned, it's also written up on shipwreckworld.com, and if it's also on the Great Lakes Shipwreck Research Group, our social media group, where it's been up for, I think, a year or so. So thank you again, and hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you very much.